Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we're taking a look at something which is going to be a trigger point for some people and a godsend for others. This is the AMD Radeon RX6600 Challenger D 8GB model from ASRock. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at the AMD Radeon RX6600 Challenger D from ASRock. This is the 8GB version. Now, first of all, obviously the RX6600 was one of those graphics cards which, when it released in 2021, it wasn't really that much of a bargain proposition. It had a high price, it had reduced capabilities such as the PCI Express bus being only down to 8 lanes, and also the memory bus being cut down to 128 bits, which is normally reserved for lower end cards. Add in a retail price of somewhere around the £350 mark. Yeah, the RX6600 when it was released was not a particularly good option, and there were obviously plenty of other choices around, such as the RTX 3060, which was basically the same price, pretty much same performance, but with a few other features, obviously DLSS and also the ability for a little bit of ray tracing. So you're probably thinking, well, why are you actually doing a review on this and why have you actually bought one? Well, the reason is times do change, and fortunately for the RX6600, the price has dropped pretty considerably. This one here at the moment is available in the UK at July 2023 for about £180. I actually picked this one up from Tech Next Day and actually got a 10% voucher as well, so got it for £170, which I think for a graphics card like this is stellar value. You quite often see this actually on UK sites at the moment for somewhere between £190 and £200, which is still a little bit of an ask for a card of this particular performance, but when you look at other items on the new market, such as the 4060, even the 3060 12GB, etc., those are often considerably more money and edging towards even £350. So in terms of value for money, this at the moment is pretty much your best bang for buck on the new market. Now, other considerations on the new market which are even less appealing are things like the RX6400 and also the RX6500 XT, which actually still retail for somewhere around the £150, £160 mark. You can sometimes pick up a 6400 for about £130, £140, but these cards, I would say, unless you are really, really desperate, it's definitely worth stretching a little bit further in your budget to pick up one of these. In terms of specifications, this isn't a great deal over the kind of default specs from AMD. We're looking at a boost clock of 12491 MHz, a game clock of 2044 MHz, and a base clock of 1626. So nothing to really write home about there. We do have support for RDNA 2 along with DirectX 12 Ultimate Edition. Like I said earlier, this is running as a PCI Express Gen 4 card, although it is only using a x8 bus. So for some people, especially if you're on an older motherboard which only supports PCI Express Gen 3, potentially in some instances you may see a reduction in performance. So there's a brief introduction to the card. Let's talk about some of the positive aspects of the RX6600. Now, one of them for me personally is the wattage, basically the amount of power it uses. Now, in testing this with a handful of games, we're looking at somewhere around about 100 watts as the reported usage power-wise, which is fantastic. It only requires a 500 watt power supply. Potentially you could get away with less. And also it only has a single 8-pin PCIe Express connector, so you should be able to use this with pretty modest power supplies. And also it's not going to need an absolute horrendous amount of cable management, unlike those cards with dual or even triple ports. So let's take a closer look at the actual card itself, and it's a pretty decent design, although the fans I feel are a little bit oversized for what they actually need to be. Pros and cons, obviously a little bit harder to fit in smaller form factor PCs, but if you've got the room, it does stay ridiculously quiet and ridiculously cool, at least compared with other graphics cards. This is basically inaudible. It has got zero fan technology, so the fans that are on there will only spin after it gets to around about 40 degrees Celsius. Anything over that, realistically, you're not going to see that often. Even in gaming, we're looking at temperatures around about 55 degrees Celsius, actually for the core, and the hotspots up to around about 63. So normally there is about a 10-degree difference between the actual core and hotspots. And yeah, it's still very hard to get this thing over 65 degrees Celsius. The actual design itself is rather minimalist. There's not a great deal going on. You've got some geometric shapes going on there. And to be honest with you, I feel that some of the extra shapes they've added in there does give a slightly cheaper look. And if we flip it around onto the side, you can see where some of the cost cutting has actually happened. So we've got the exposed pipes there, which have just been left as their natural state. Even though it has got a backplate, it doesn't travel a great deal down the card, which again is helpful for cooling. So the fan here has actually got direct airflow going in and straight out through, so nothing blocking it on the backside. Again, this is going to help with temps. But yeah, it's not a particularly good looking card in my opinion, but realistically, the looks aren't something that most people will go for because they just want to use it for gaming. And in terms of gaming, connects up to monitors. You've got the option for 4 display outputs. You've got a single HDMI, which is supporting HDMI 2.1 and variable refresh rate, and you've got 3 DisplayPort 1.4s. So it's a relatively bland card and hasn't got a great deal going for it, but again, like I said, what it's down to is it actually any good for gaming? Now this was actually marketed, and actually I think even on the box it does state on there 1080p gaming, so I thought today would be a good idea to actually try and stretch its legs a little bit in a couple of titles and actually see what it behaves like at 1440p and also 1080p either high or ultra settings in a splattering of games. So first of all, we're going to take a look at CSGO. Now this is a pretty easy one to run anyway. This is running at 1440p ultra settings, and we're looking at somewhere of around about 275 frames per second as an average. When it comes to temperatures, we're looking at 50 degrees Celsius for the core and around about 60 degrees Celsius for the hotspot. And we're drawing somewhere in the region of about 84 to 85 watts, which is, yeah, basically nothing. The game runs really well, very smoothly, no huge dips here and there, and a very enjoyable experience, even though we're not playing at AMD's recommended 1080p. Just to give you an idea of base specifications, so we'll just run a Time Spy. Again, Time Spy is 1440p, and we've got 8,101 points as our GPU score. So if you want to run Time Spy yourself and see what your graphics card gets, this is a reference point. Back into gaming, let's take a look at something a little bit more heavy duty. So this is Cyberpunk 2077, and this again is running at 1440p, high settings. I've actually let the settings just use the initial preset, so FSR will be on here, and we're looking at anywhere between around 60 FPS. So if you are looking to play Cyberpunk at 1440p with relatively high settings, then 60 FPS is what you should likely see. Obviously with this game it's infinitely configurable, so if you do want to get a little bit more FPS or you want to increase the eye candy but reduce the FPS, then you certainly can do. Again, with this, it's a very common story throughout the rest of the testing. We're looking around about 55 degrees Celsius for the GPU core and around about 65 degrees Celsius on the hotspot. Again, we're drawing 100 watts. Next up, something which is infinitely easier to run, so let's take a look at Rocket League. This again is at 1440p with the highest settings. This we're getting an average of somewhere around 220 FPS. Again, very boring, around about 54 degrees Celsius on the core, around about 63 degrees Celsius actually on the hotspots, and we're drawing just under 100 watts here pretty much all the time. Runs very nicely, very smooth, looks great, and again, this is 1440p, not 1080p. Now looking at another driving game, something which requires a little bit more horsepower, so this is Wreckfest. Again, we are running at 1440p with ultra settings, and we're getting somewhere in the region of about 160 FPS. Now this game is, again, one of those things where depending on what map you're on, your mileage may vary, and certainly at the beginning, in very congested areas, your FPS will drop considerably. But as things even out across the road, or track, or dirt, or wherever you are, then you should find pretty good results, around about 150 to 200 frames per second, depending where you are. Again, very boring, temps 55 degrees Celsius, 63 degrees Celsius on the hotspot, and again, drawing around about 100 watts from the GPU. Next up, something a little bit different. So this is War Thunder. Now this is running at 1080p, maximum settings. Could have pushed it easy to 1440p, but unfortunately, due to me messing around with my capture card, it just went to 1080p for some reason. So with this, we're looking at somewhere around 225 FPS as an average, which is very much playable for this particular title. Very slick, very smooth, and looks really good. We're looking around about, again, 55 degrees Celsius, 64 degrees on the hotspot, and we're drawing just under 100 watts again, which is pretty much going to be the same regardless of what you're playing. Next up, a slightly more modern AAA title. This is Dead Island 2. This is 1080p Ultra, using the Ultra preset, which is in the game, and with this we're averaging somewhere around 130 FPS. Again, very boring, 55 degrees Celsius on the GPU, around about 64 degrees Celsius on the hotspot. Again, drawing anywhere up to 100 watts from the AMD tool there that it's reporting. Very nice gameplay, very smooth, and even when you get a lot of stuff going on the screen, a lot of action, a lot of characters, a lot of NPCs, etc., even with some of the more spectacular effects which this game actually can generate with electrical weapons, etc., and explosions, it still runs really, really well. I think some of this is actually helped by when you actually kill someone in a slightly horrific way, the frame rate slows down cinematically to show off your kill, which, because there's a lot going on screen, actually does help gameplay. And last up, we're going to take a look at a game which is a favourite for a lot of people, and potentially why you might be buying this graphics card anyway, if you want to get into playing Fortnite. So this is 1080p running at epic settings. So this is just the default preset. So this is going to enable FSR to some extent, although really Fortnite does favour Nvidia cards, but this certainly runs really nicely. We're looking somewhere around about 70 FPS as an average. Again, very boring for the temperatures, about 55 degrees Celsius on the core, around about 65 degrees Celsius on the hotspot, and drawing just under 100 watts as per usual. Again, this game looks absolutely great. There's a lot going on here, and if you want to, you can increase the settings slightly more. Maybe if you don't want epic for everything, maybe just set your draw distance to epic. You can push this to 1440p and still get a very playable result. Obviously, if you want super high frames per second, then you can put it into performance mode or just lower the settings accordingly. But overall, very nice, very smooth, looks great, and doesn't make a racket whilst doing it. So there you go, there are some examples of gameplay with this particular card. Now, this isn't a review as such because we haven't really compared it with any other titles, and obviously the ratings and also the FPS that we're getting is going to be dependent on my own settings, my processor. This was actually tested on an AM5 platform running a 7700X, and it ran absolutely fine. There was a couple of unusual bugs with the AMD driver, whether that's an AM5 platform thing or whether it's just AMD being AMD, who knows. It is one of those things, and I did actually put my Nvidia card back in, as you can see in there now, and the problem still existed, so I think it is maybe a Windows update or something. So potentially we might even be able to squeeze a bit more out of this. Drivers with AMD can often be problematic, but having said that, something that AMD is really known for is their fine wine technologies. So when you buy an Nvidia card, pretty much the performance you get out of the box, unless there's a specific bug, is pretty much the performance you're going to get at the end of the day. Whereas with these AMD cards, when they come out, you can see the benchmarks, but as time goes on, the actual driver does appear to improve performance. Although only a little bit, but every little does help, especially when you're in the more budget end of the market. So there you go, there is the Radeon RX6600. This one is, again, the ASRock Challenger D 8GB model. To be honest with you, I'm not too sure how I feel about this. At £170, I feel like I've got somewhat of a bargain, but the way things are in the GPU market at the moment, potentially if you can pick up a used card such as an RX 5700 or a 2060 Super for considerably less money, then potentially that might be the way to go. And in fact, if you're looking for an RX 5700 for a considerably cheaper price, then check out our review of the Elsa 5700. That was a great bargain from AliExpress, although there are going to be things, obviously you're going to wait for it, have to make sure they're in stock and it is potentially refurbished, etc. Whereas this is a brand spanking new card and available next day from the majority of suppliers here in the UK for not a great deal more money. So anyway, let me know what you think about this one in the comment section below. But for now, I've been Mike. This is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll catch you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.